In this lesson, we applied some styling, as well as we made multiple requests. So we nested a fetch request and another fetch request, and returning back the answer information, as well as the contents of the original question ID. And this is all dynamically loaded from the API, and all using JavaScript to load that content. In the previous lesson, we set up and we're pulling in information from the API, and then we've got a clickable element that passes over the question ID and outputs it into the console. So once we have the question ID, we can use that. So there is a way to query within the API and return back the question content. And we can close off some of these tabs that we have here. So this is the API, and we can use this API to generate the URLs. So we've got a question, and so the question, and then if we use the question IDs, we can also pull back the answers that are corresponding to the question IDs. And that's what we want to list out, is the answers. So in this case, we see we've got this as an ID. So in this case, let's clear that, click the first one, and this one has 5 answers. So we want to list the question details, but also the answers there. So we can paste the, actually we gotta copy that, just the ID value. And that produces the endpoint for us. And if you run the endpoint, this is going to list out all of the answers for that particular question. So that's going to be the path that we want to use. So you can construct it with the API and then add in the answers here, and this will give us a way to build the URL to make the request. So just as we did before, where we set up the base URL and we're doing the loading of the page, we can load the content here. So we've got our base URL, we've got the ID that we want to use here, and let's replace the content with the ID value that we want. So you can also update some of these other parameters if you want. And the ID that we want to use is contained within the string here. So update it so we can dynamically set the ID value. And then we make the fetch request. And right now we don't want to output the content yet. So we just want to go to the console log and see the data, so that we can deconstruct the data and plan how we're going to use it on the page. So clear the content and do a refresh. So look for ones that do have answers. So when we click that, we return back the array, and this is going to be the array of items. And then within the items, it's got an answer ID for whatever the question ID was. And this one has 13 answers, so this one is going to be a better representation. So it's got all of these as answers to the question. So what we want to do is we want to open up a separate page and build the results, getting the question information, but also returning back the answer information as well. So there's a number of ways that we can do this, where one is that we can query again to get the question information. So if we query and return back the question results, so in this case we've got this as the ID, and go back and get questions and get the questions according to the ID. So this is going to return back the question information. So we can make a separate query and get the question information. So let's do that, where we've got URL 2 or URL 1, and then use the base URL, and then add to the base URL the path for the question content. In addition, we could pass in, because we already got the question content, so we could potentially load that into an array as well. So depending on how we want to do that, there's a number of options that are available for us. So this would be the path to get the question details. So let's load first the first URL. Actually, let's change the order, because we want to load the question details after we complete loading the main URL content. So loading the URL 1 first, And then when we complete that, then we make another fetch request and we're going to load the second URL. So let's refresh that. And it looks like there was a path problem here with our API. And we did end up with a slash again. So that's where that error was coming from. So try that one more time. And so first we're going to load through the contents and returning back the question with this as the ID. So just make sure it is the right question ID. So we've got all of that information there being loaded. So we can load this, and then after that we can load all of the answers. So in this case we see that it's got 3 answers, and then we can make a second request to the answers. So we're going to nest the first set of data and add it into the second set of data. So creating a variable that can hold the first set of data. So this is going to be the main item info, and we're just going to set up a blank object for that, and then we're going to populate that content as data and set the contents of info to there, and we're going to then nest a second fetch request. So once we make the initial fetch request, we're returning back the JSON content as data, and the next item we're going to then return back and do a second fetch, and this is going to be making a request to the URL 2. And once that promise completes, this is also going to have a response object, so we can pull back the response data and return the response data as JSON, and then output that new data object. So we can also call it data as well, or we could call it, give it another variable name. And then here we're going to output the contents of info, item info, as well as the answers array, or the answers object, and that's going to be contained within data. So now we've nested the object information, and I'm going to remove out some of the console content because we've got quite a bit of stuff logging into the console. So let's do a replace on the code and look for console log, and with the console log we'll just add in the backslash in front of all the instances of it and do a replace on all instances of it, and then where we want to output it, we just want to output it within this part here. So now when we click one of the items that has multiple answers, the second array that we have here, the second object that we have with the items, is all of the answers. And we've got the first one here is what's being returned back for questions resulting in from what we've got within the question by the ID of the question. So we're ready to output the content onto a page. So we'll create another function, build page data, and we can pass through from the first item info. So this is going to be just whatever the question data is, and select from the items array. So item info, and take items, and we're just going to return back the first result from the items. And right now within the build data function, so create the function build page data is just going to get the main question, and right now we'll just output the question object. So we click it, and let's clear it. And here we see that we're listing out the main question data under Q. We also want to pass over the array of items. So this is going to be the answers, and get the answer items and then pass those in. And this is going to be an array. So we'll pluralize that. And first we're going to output the question contents, and then we'll output the contents of the result, the answers array. So let's do a reload. So this one's good. It's got 3 answers. So click that. And instead of outputting everything, we're going to log out that information. So it's a little bit easier to troubleshoot as we're passing in the 2 objects. And this actually should be data items. So let's try that one more time. Find one that has some answers. And so this is returning back the question information, and then also the answers that are associated with the question. So we're ready to output them on the page and build the page content. So clearing out the output in our HTML, and then we're also going to be looping through each one of the items there. So each one of the answers. And right now we're just going to do a console log of each one of the answer items. And this actually should be answers that we're looping through. And we can also refer to it as item. Or actually, let's just refer to it as answer, and then output the answer into the console. So there's each one of the answers being output into the console. And then we can deconstruct this object information to extract the data that we want, the property values that we want. And for the object itself, let's pull out some information and add it, such as the title, the question ID. We can also include the link, and the answer count. So we're going to add those 4 properties onto the page. And we're just adding it to the main output area. So let's use the element creator that we have, the make node, and do the make node function and return back the content that we need. So that's coming into the question, title, and this is going to be referencing the main title. So we can set that as an H2 as we're outputting the HTML. So this is going to be just going right to output. And we can set this up as the title. Next, we want to output the question ID as well. QID. So let's return back the question ID value from the property names. Output that, and this can just be done within a div. So separate it out as a div. And it's making just another div node. And then the other properties that we want to output. So maybe we want to do a link. So this can just be the link. And we'll output, so this is going into a hyperlink. So the contents of this are going to be from the question link, and that's what we're going to output there. And for the link, we can set the attribute of href, and that can equal whatever the question link value is. And also for the link, set attribute, and we'll set the attribute of target to be equal to blank. So it's going to open up on a new page. So let's see what we have so far. So when we click it, we've got the links there. So these are active hyperlinks, and loads to the question. We've got the ID value, so it's the title. We've got the question ID. And let's add that into, so we know what that's referring to. So question ID, we've got the hyperlink. And what other information did we want to load? Let's click it. And we also want to load the number of answers that there are. So create one more. Total. And answers. And we're just going to reference the number of answers. And that's contained under the answer count. So we've got 3 answers, question, and then the link, the hyperlink. So we want to loop through and output the answers on the page as well. And we're just going to append those to the output, or we can create another element, another div. And this can just serve as our main container for the answers, so in case we want to apply some styling to it. So making a node, and the content of this one is just going to be blank. And as we loop through, these are the contents that we have for the answers. So we've got an ID value for the answer. And let's use the same function to make the node. And this time we're appending it to the answer div. And this can be a div. And let's create some contents for HTML. So this is what we're going to contain into the element. And then this will just be whatever we're building as the HTML content. So here we can add in the answer ID and whatever other values that we want to add. So answer and answer ID. And let's just do a line break. So for each one of these, and we could also then afterwards query to get the answer information. But right now we'll just get the owner contents. So under the owner display name. So that's going to be contained within the answer. And that's under the owner object. And then that's the display name that we have for the owner. So let's see what we have so far. When we click to load the answers, and as we loop through, let's get an index value for the answers. So that way, and adding in an answer number. So this will be whatever the index is plus 1. And do another line break there. And add in a horizontal rule. So let's load one that has multiple answers. So this one has 2 answers. So we click it, we get answer 1, answer 2. And maybe we'll do the horizontal rule above. So 3 answers, 1, 2, and 3. And then these are the results. And of course, you can select more information from the owner if you want. You can add in despite their display name, also accept rate as well. So that's maybe another number that you want to add. And so we'll just bracket that under answer, owner, and the accept rate. So add the $ and the curly brackets to add that value in. And let's try that one more time. So let's do rating. And then rating, if it's undefined, so that's going to be under this variable. So if the rating is, if this is equal to, or we can just set it as that, or it's just going to be blank. And then add that value in as rating. So that way, hopefully we don't have the undefined anymore. And it just adds in the slash if there's no value associated with it. So now we're ready to apply some styling, and we actually have to add the click event to the entire object, as we've only got the click event on the title. And let's add the click event to the main object. So that way we can click any part of the main object. And let's refresh it. And that's working a little bit better. So if we're getting undefined here for the question ID, then we shouldn't add the option to click it. Or if we do click it, and if the ID is undefined, so we do the get by ID. So do a quick check to see if LID exists. Then we do all this stuff. Otherwise, we're just going to write that there's been an error, that we're not able to click it. And we'll just output that into the console. So some of them don't have an ID, and those ones aren't clickable. Let's apply some styling to the content and do an inspect on this. So for the main element, and we'll just give it a class of info. And let's set the width to 80%. Border. And let's set the font size. And then apply the class of info to the main element as we're getting it by ID, and then we're building the page data. And taking the answer div and class list, let's add the class of info. So we need to find one with some answers. And that one doesn't have an ID, so it's not clickable. And actually, the ones that don't have IDs, let's gray those out. So as we're showing them, so we can also just not have an event listener on them either. So if question ID, then we add the event listener. Otherwise, we're going to gray out the element. So to take May, style, and we'll add a background. And add a background color. Now just move that in. And then also let's output to the content. So we'll add some more content to the node. And this is just going to indicate whatever the ID is. So it's adding it to the main, and this is going to be the Q ID that we have. And that's going to just be referencing the question ID. And we've got to give it a new, different name. And question ID. So we'll output that to the page as well. So it looks like some of them aren't passing in the question ID properly. And they all do appear to have a question ID. So we need to do some troubleshooting to check to see why this ID is not passing within the element QID. And maybe we can output it this way just to double check and see if it's outputting. So it is being registered within the object. And maybe to be sure, we'll just update the get by ID. And we'll call the function manually get by ID. And then we'll pass in the ID of the element. And this is just going to take the value of the question ID. And the only value that we need here is the question ID. So this is going to be taking the QID. We don't need the target anymore. And let's update these values here. And save it. So now whenever we click it, they should all be working. And let's double check the element and see if we're applying the styling. So it doesn't look like we're applying the styling. We are applying the styling of info to that element itself. So let's set a margin of auto. And you can apply styling as needed to the element content. So these are all the answers. I'm also going to use some Google fonts. And add in the Google font into the styling of the page. And add that just into the body of the page. So first we import the style, and then to the body, the font family. We can add this as the font family. So let's see what that looks like. Let's change the way the application looks. And we also might want to apply some styling there within this main container, within the output container. So just comma separate and add it to output as well. So now we're loading the question content dynamically depending on what the question is. And let's do one more quick look and see what we've got for the API. So we can as well do a search within the API. And this is going to be the search. So we're going to add in still a quick option to do a search within the input and be able to click and update and output the content of the search. So that's coming up in part 3. The challenges for this lesson and the tasks for this lesson are to make multiple fetch requests to the endpoint and return back data. So nesting in a fetch request within another fetch request. So we're getting the question information as well as the answers content, and then building out the page content dynamically according to what the JSON data returns. And then also, depending on what the user selection is, outputting some page content.